Alexander Hamilton. The character Aaron Burr opens this song and the musical with a summary of the life of Alexander Hamilton. And those first words catch you. How does a bastard, orphan, son of a whore and a Scotsman, dropped in the middle of a forgotten spot in the Caribbean by Providence, impoverished, in squalor, grow up to be a hero and a scholar? There's an awful lot packed in those first four lines. Question, how did he do it? And then there's the characterizations of him by Burr, who is obviously the antagonist. He's a bastard, he's illegitimate, he's an orphan, his parents are dead or abandoned him. His mother, they're questioning her character. His father was the fourth son of the Laird of Grange in Scotland. He's born in the middle of the Caribbean, in the sleepy town of Charleston on the island of Nevis in the Leeward Islands. Where is that? He's impoverished. After his mother dies, his father comes and confiscates anything that had been his mother's. So he's left in abject poverty, living in squalor because he can't afford much. Yet, this man becomes a scholar. This man becomes a hero of the revolution. And he's one of the founding fathers of our country. And the company goes on after this first bit to continue to fill us in on what Paul Harvey used to say was the rest of the story. How he taught himself, how he resolved he was not going to be left where he was, that he would survive, and he'd work to improve his circumstances. In the years after Jesus' death, his resurrection and his ascension, and the disciples and the other followers of Jesus want to tell his story. I don't doubt that they were asked the same questions, faced with the same skepticism and the disbelief from their friends, from their family, from their neighbors, those that they tried to talk to about this Rabbi Jesus. Who was this Jesus? You say he's the Messiah, but how can you make those claims about him? He was born to Mary, an unwed mother. She was engaged to Joseph, but Jesus was not his child. What does that say about his mother? Your Messiah was illegitimate, wasn't he? Wasn't he a bastard? There were most likely also those that questioned, where was Joseph in all of this? Was he still alive? Was Jesus an orphan? He came from Nazareth in Galilee. And as we may have heard some say in the Gospels, what good can come from Galilee? Wasn't the Messiah to be born a descendant of King David? Wasn't the Messiah supposed to be a mighty military ruler who would reestablish Israel as a great military power? The Roman Empire crucified him as a dangerous revolutionary. So how does this man, how do you claim him as the Messiah? How does he help to reestablish Israel as a great and mighty nation? It's fake news. Can't be. Not possible. Fake news. So as Matthew begins to write his gospel, his purpose is to prove that Jesus is much more than just these accusations. Matthew sets out to prove to his audience that this man, Jesus, is the fulfillment of the nation of Israel's purpose and their long-held hopes. From the opening paragraph, Matthew is writing to establish Jesus' identity. He's writing to establish Jesus in his place as the fulfillment of the scriptures. But before we go any further, I need to say this. You know those 17 verses of the beginning of Matthew, where Matthew goes through all of those generations? If you were to look at that genealogy, Matthew's genealogy is not historically accurate. In fact, if you compare it with Luke chapter 3, beginning at verse 23, there are major differences between the genealogy that Matthew gives us and the genealogy that Luke gives us. In fact, you'll find most of the names won't even match. In fact, in Matthew, let's see, where did I put in my papers here? Matthew gives us, Matthew gives us 42 generations, but he says there's 42, 3 groups of 14, right? But if you try and make a graph of them, you'll find there's only 41. There's 2 groups of 14 and 1 of 13. Luke gives us 56 generations. Matthew, in creating this lineage, has it come from David through Solomon so that Jesus is of a royal lineage. But in Luke, Luke traces Jesus' lineage through Nathan, a son of David, so that there is not a royal lineage. So we need to understand that there's a different purpose for Matthew. Matthew is trying to serve a theological purpose, to be able to prove in the numbering of 14 that Jesus is the fulfillment. Numerology meant something to him, that at the end of this genealogy, Jesus is the culmination of all of God's work. Just like Lin-Manuel Miranda sets the musical stage for us to have a brief overview of the family history and background of Alexander Hamilton, so Matthew wants to set the stage for our audience, or his audience, to understand who this man Jesus was and where he comes from. You see, to Matthew, Jesus is the central, the ultimate character in the story of God's saving activity in our world. For Matthew, the story begins with Abraham. It reaches a high point in the reign of King David. Then it falls to very much a low point with the deposing of the kings by Babylon and the exile of the royal family and the elite into Babylon. And then with the return into Israel, it again builds to the ultimate climax in the life and the ministry, death and resurrection of Jesus. Matthew is remaining true to his Jewish faith by telling the story of Jesus as one of our Creator God, remaining faithful to God's creation, never letting go, never abandoning that work of creation. But God is always at work to fulfill God's promises and God's covenants. That's why Matthew pointedly names some specific women in that theological lineage that he is building of Jesus. I don't know if you recognized any of those names. Tamar. She's the Canaanite woman who married the oldest son of Judah, Jacob's son. Died, the Bible tells us, because he was wicked and God killed him. Then she was supposed to marry, as was the custom, the next son in line, Onan. But Onan did not want to be the father of his brother's children, so he died. There was a younger brother, Shelah, that was supposed to be then married to her, but he was too young in Judah's opinion. So he said to Tamar, no, you can't marry him yet, but wait, live as a widow until he's old enough. But then as time went on, Judah didn't follow through on his promise. So what Tamar had to do was to trick her father-in-law. When she heard he was with his sheep up in the pastures, she dressed herself as a prostitute, sat by the side of the road, and he utilized her services, and she conceived. When Judah heard that his widowed daughter-in-law was pregnant, he wanted to have her stoned. But you see, when he went into her, she said, for payment of services, what I want is your signet ring, and I want your staff, and I want your cloak. So that when Judah wanted to have Tamar stoned as an adulteress, she said, first, tell me who these are. This is the father of my child. And Judah realized he was the father of his daughter-in-law's child. So he spared Tamar's life and told her that she was more righteous than he was because he had not followed through on his promises. So Tamar, and this story is in Matthew's lineage of Jesus. Then there's Rahab, the Gentile from Jericho, who was a prostitute, lived on the wall, in a house on the wall of Jericho, who hid the spies that Joshua sent to check out the city before Israel attacked it, to take it over. She becomes the mother of Boaz in this story. Then there is Ruth, the Gentile, from the country of Moab, when Naomi and her husband and their 2 sons fled the famine in Israel. Ruth married one of Naomi's sons who died. And when the famine was finished in Israel, she decides to return to Israel with Naomi. And you may recall her famous expression when Naomi says, go back to your country because I can't have any sons for you at this point. I'm way too old. Ruth says, no, where you go, I will go. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. Ruth's allegiance was to her mother-in-law. Even as a Moabite, someone that Deuteronomy tells us people from Moab were specifically excluded from the nation of Israel, she is included. And Ruth, with her husband Boaz, becomes the great-grandmother of King David. And then in the story, Matthew names the wife of Uriah, does not give her a name. But we all know the story of Bathsheba and David. And how can we forget the circumstances under which David raped Bathsheba and then murdered her husband Uriah to cover up his crime? And the child that is born, the first child dies, and Solomon is then the second son. of David and Bathsheba. All of this is in the history that Matthew gives us that is the lineage of Jesus. These women who come from the outside are brought into that line that brings us to Jesus. In fact, Matthew doesn't name it, but if you were to go back to Jacob, Jacob had two wives, right? A first wife, Leah, second wife, Rachel. Jacob really didn't want to marry Leah, but Laban tricked him and made Jacob work 7 years thinking that he would have Rachel for his wife. And in the end, at the marriage, Jacob finds out he's not married Rachel, he's married Leah. And then Laban makes him work another 7 years so that he can have Rachel for his wife. That wife that Jacob never really wanted, that Jacob did not love, that wife, Leah, is the mother of Judah, who Matthew traces that lineage of Jesus. So we can see as we look at this, all of these women who were either not wanted, were outcast, that were considered to be outsiders. Some might say they thought it was questionable sexual activity on their parts. Whether or not it's questionable, as in Rahab, or it is horrible circumstances with David and Bathsheba, all of these become part of that line that leads to Jesus the Christ. And Matthew wants us to understand that no matter the background, God is able to take even those that we would reject, even those of who of us ourselves might consider ourselves unworthy, not possible to be included in the work of salvation, in the work of God's redeeming in the world. God pulls all of these people in. And Matthew does that and includes that to ensure that his audience understands that the story of God's saving work in the world is one of inclusiveness. We often think of Jesus being the example of love and reaching out to always include the outsiders. We remember his meeting the Samaritan woman at the well. We remember his confrontation with the Syrophoenician woman, or the woman with the issue of blood, or the woman who wants help with her daughter when he says, you know, it's not for the dogs. And she says, but even the dogs eat from the master's table. We think that Jesus learned about love and was the beginning of that. But Matthew says, no, God's saving history, God's work with this world has always brought in the outsiders. Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, all of these women are part of that history. They're part of God's using outsiders for a larger and bigger purpose in this world. God had promised Abram that he would make from him a great nation. And in that nation, all of the world would be blessed. So when we think of this, when we hear the genealogy of Jesus, when we hear of those of questionable background that are included in that genealogy, that is good news for us. Because God's work is always surprising. It comes to include even us when we least expect it. It pulls us from communities where we may feel marginalized, whether it's because we are part of the LGBT community or we're a person of color. It's especially for us right now in this time and place, a reminder that God comes for Black lives and brown lives and everyone. No one is excluded in God's kingdom. No one is an outsider. No one is to be not part of God's work. And as the church, as people who claim to follow Jesus, it is our work to make sure that everyone feels included, that no one is excluded. There is no reason for us not to stand up and to demand that our Black brothers and sisters be treated with the same respect, equality, and justice that we receive in our communities. It means that access to education, to employment, to housing, to voting rights, to food, and to health care must be equal for all people. Everyone. No one is to be excluded. And we are to work hard to make sure that those that are sitting on the margins, those who have been pushed to the margins or are not included, that we gather them in and we work to make sure that they are included. It's our responsibility to correct the scales that have been unfairly and unevenly weighted against them. Toward the end of the song, Alexander Hamilton, the company sings, "In New York, you can be a new man," reminded me that as those who believe in Jesus Christ, that is also something we can say or we should hear and remember to include ourselves in Jesus Christ. We can be a new person. We hear God's call to us to be transformed, to become a new and different and better person, dedicated to bring God's kingdom to this world. Jesus taught his disciples to pray, "Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." That's our mission and purpose in life, to reach out to those that have been pushed to the margins of our society and bring them into the center of God's light and love, to include them in the fullness of the radical hospitality and the extravagant grace that God offers to us all. In God's love and by God's grace, we can be a new person, a new people, a new congregation. Just you wait. The world need not ever be the same as it is today. We hear the question, "What's your name, man?" Yeshua of Nazareth. He's our man. Amen.